Welcome and thank you for joining Seyfarth's webinar, Privacy and Data Security, Increasing Impacts on the Transportation and Logistics Industries. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program through the Q&A section located on the right side of your screen. We will do our best to get to everyone's questions. Any unanswered questions will be followed up by email after the webinar. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the recording and presentation materials will be distributed tomorrow or the next day. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to John Skelton. John, you may begin.
Thank you, Kim. Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, data is a very highly valuable asset to any company. It also is a vulnerability for those companies' employees, systems, and software. In the transportation and logistics industries, where innovation is at the forefront and automation are all continuing to advance, issues surrounding privacy and data can certainly leave a company vulnerable. Today's webinar, we want to focus on data and privacy issues impacting the transportation and logistics industry and all of the various companies involved. My name is John Skelton. I am a partner at Seyfarth's Boston office. I'm the co-chair of the firm's franchise and distribution committee and co-chair of our transportation and logistics working group. I will be one of your hosts, but I just get to ask the questions today because we have two people here that are much smarter than I am. Today, we're joined by Amy Hong. Amy is a partner in our Washington, D.C. office. She specializes in government contracts. John Tomaszewski is a partner in our Houston office, and John specializes in data protection and management. John and Amy, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for sharing your thoughts. So let's just get right into it. The first question that I have is that the transportation and logistic industries have seen tremendous advancement in technology, innovation, automation, and with that, an ever-increasing prevalence of data. What do each of you see as the most significant changes with respect to data security and privacy over the last, say, 5 to 10 years resulting from that advancement in technology? John, maybe I'll go to you first on that one.
Thanks, John. There are two Johns, the dueling Johns. I'm going to speak kind of broadly in terms of what I'm seeing in the trends in the space generally, and that is really the supply chain has exploded in the number of participants that are out there. So when you look at what transportation and logistics did 15 years ago, the number of players, the number of touch points where other companies come into the supply chain were nowhere near as many as there are now. So the idea of a much larger number of players throughout the supply chain and a much larger use of technology in each one of those players is one of the things I think is significantly different. This is true for not just the transportation and logistics industry, but it's particularly true for T&L because of the way that it manages supply chain and all the different players that are there in terms of dealing with driving efficiencies and driving cost savings in supply chain. So you've got a lot of tech that is being implemented in ways that tech wasn't really originally viewed as being part of transportation and logistics, and you've got a lot more players in the space, and so you've got a lot more potential threat vectors where each one of the participants in the supply chain is its own individual potential threat vector. So it's a lot more complex of an ecosystem. There are a lot more bits and pieces that are out there that are potentially compromisable. And any one of those locations where you can see a compromise can have knock-on effects throughout the supply chain. The ripple effect is much, much more intense now than it used to be. So the risk environment is one that requires a bit more thought and a bit more thought in directions that we haven't normally seen before. that's kind of the high arching, overarching view of what the changes have been in the T&L space, at least from my point of view.
And Amy, how about you from, on the government contract side?
Sure. I think you're going to hear variations on the same theme here, but from my perspective, it's really just the fact that data security and privacy considerations and risks, you're seeing them across a much broader scope of industries than you might have seen 10 years ago. And I think a great example of this is in the infrastructure bill that passed in November 2021. You think infrastructure, you think roads, bridges, ports, but this is not your grandfather's infrastructure. So in addition to these very standard infrastructure projects, you have almost $2 billion dedicated in the infrastructure bill to cyber spending. And a lot of that is going to modernize the systems to protect public infrastructure, because again, you're not dealing with just a road anymore. You're dealing with a more sophisticated system, and with a more sophisticated system is going to come additional cybersecurity vulnerabilities that have to be considered when you're thinking about how much these systems are going to cost and how you build them and how you protect them. So I think I'm really interested in seeing how this broader scope of industries adapts and responds to these increasing cyber threats across a much broader scope of industries than I think we used to see.
And if I could kind of add just a little bit to that, when Amy's talking about embedded systems, it's really important to recognize a lot of things that we thought were dumb previously are no longer dumb, and they have a cybersecurity component to it. For example, electrified roads, toll roads, port cranes, containers. These are all things that have the potential for actually having the capacity to be connected or be part of the Internet of Things. And so it's a lot more complicated than it used to be, because stuff that we used to think was dumb is now becoming smart.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so sticking on that theme a little bit, John, in your first answer, you talked a lot about the supply chain and its growing, width, breadth, and complexity. So how has that complexity of the supply chain impacted the need for your clients, to address data security and privacy issues? And maybe Amy, I'll start with you on that one. The complexity of supply chain, what do clients really need to be thinking about in addressing security and data issues?
Sure. And, the vast majority of my clients are government contractors, whether it's on the federal level or the state or local level. But I think a lot of these themes extend to both the public and private industry. But anytime you're introducing new links in the supply chain, you're introducing new vulnerabilities. And as a federal prime contractor, those are really vulnerabilities that the government will hold you responsible for. You have a lot of the responsibility to control your supply chain and ensure that whatever product or service you, as the prime contractor, are delivering to the end customer is free from those vulnerabilities. And it can be difficult enough for a prime contractor to even, grasp hold of the security of its own systems, right? But then when you're talking about control over your direct subcontracts, that might be one thing. But then how do you control your subcontractors' relationships with their subcontractors and their subcontractors? So from my perspective, I am seeing a lot more of my prime contractors taking a much more direct and, you might say, aggressive approach in terms of flowing down security requirements to their supply chain. Where in the past we might have just seen, a flow down on paper, and you kind of leave it up to your suppliers to comply because you've done your job by passing that clause along. We're seeing prime contractors take a lot more of a direct approach. So in terms of, maybe security audits, or maybe wanting to see some sort of third-party verification, certification. or having, pretty aggressive notification requirements in terms of breaches or suspected breaches. But across the board, taking a more direct approach to their supply chains compliance with cybersecurity, rather than leaving it up to each link in the supply chain to be responsible for the next link down.
And we're going to touch upon, because I have a question about contracts, and we're going to touch upon that in a bit. John, you had mentioned in terms of this complexity of supply chain, I think you would, use the, threat vectors and its expanding scope. I'm wondering if you can comment on the complexity of the supply chain and that increasing data and privacy risks.
Sure. So the Internet of Things is a term that gets used a lot, which is kind of a way to describe the fact that the compute environment that we deal with, in other words, the data management, the data computational environment we deal with, is no longer limited to things like laptops and smartphones. I actually have a pair of cufflinks where one of them is a Wi-Fi hotspot and the other one is a USB drive, and I can actually compromise the network of a room with my cufflinks. So there's a whole bunch of stuff floating around out there that we have to worry about that is not necessarily what we, again, thought about previously. So, for example, there are sensors that you can put on a shipping container that, using an evaluation of the electromagnetic spectra, can tell you whether or not hazardous materials are in the shipping container. That sensor is Wi-Fi enabled. That Wi-Fi sensor, because it is capable of connecting to a network, it has the capacity, if malware is in that sensor or in that Wi-Fi hotspot, can then inject malware elsewhere. So every time you have a connection to a network, whether it's a sensor on a shipping container or it's a set of cufflinks, you have the capacity, because that's an entry point, to inject malware into that space. And so whether it's telematics devices on trucks, it's sensing precise geolocation sensors on cranes, it's flow meters on pipelines, it's all of these things. We have sensors all over the place. And those sensors are connected, because if they're not connected, you can't use them. They're not very useful. And those all flow back into generally a series of interconnected systems which control that environment. Most of those systems are actually no longer on proprietary networks. 20 years ago, they were. So if you had a sensor array in, for example, a petroleum plant, that sensor array would be on a closed network that you would actually have to physically go in and connect to in order to see that anything off of that sensor array. With the advent of TCP/IP, which is the protocol for the internet, most of those networks are now using the same standard access protocol, and as a consequence, or management protocol, and as a consequence, because they're wireless, if you're just in close proximity to these environments, you can actually tap into all of these sensors. So the ability to come in and have folks easily connect into your network is great for efficiency, because you've got, it's much easier to flip out third-party service providers, for example, who happens to be whoever ends up being able to run your trucks, or who, is managing your fleet. You don't necessarily have to have a new set of technology come in and revise that when you change vendors, because all of the vendors are running off of the same platform. But that ease of use, that ease of access, creates a risk associated with, now we can, because it's easy to access, easily inject malware into the environment. And that's true up and downstream. And one of the things I want to kind of comment on with regard to what Amy was saying earlier is, a lot of my clients are the downstream folks. And so one of the things we have to be careful of, because we recognize that eventually we may be a subcontractor of a federal prime, we end up worrying about how to maintain a reasonable cybersecurity posture. One, because we've got to be able to sell into these environments, which are invariably, there's going to be a federal contractor or federal money around somewhere. But the other thing that's interesting about it is, a lot of this data is valuable data to us. It's performance data. How do we protect our own data and our own environments from being compromised. One, from the perspective of the data itself being valuable, and two, not having access to this data. So the idea of both upstream and downstream risk is something that's very real because of the number of different places where malware can be injected. Just as a quick example on that, and I know I'm running on a little bit, a lot of people will remember the Target hack. So Target stores got hacked and there was a big settlement. The reason why Target stores got hacked, their point of sale terminals, so the electronic cash register got hacked, is their HVAC vendor came in and connected their system, their laptop, to a store network that the point of sale terminals were on to try and evaluate a problem with the air conditioning system. Normally, no one would think that the air conditioning system is a threat vector to the point of sale terminal. So the fact that they were hacked because of a HVAC system is something that is very, very representative of why we have to worry about both upstream and downstream risk in the supply chain.
And speaking of that upstream, downstream, and you also mentioned that, the government is involved. And, so Amy, one of the things that I have noticed is over the last several years, we've seen several large omnibus spending bills coming out of, Washington and the U.S. government. You mentioned one earlier. So the government is playing an ever increasing role in the economy. As someone, that's dialed in on government contracts, can you speak to what does it mean if you are within that sphere of being a government contractor, specifically, obviously, as it relates to data privacy and security?
Yeah, I think the first point there is just how large that sphere is. And you'd be shocked by the number of times I have to break it to a company that they are in fact a government contractor, when they would swear up and down that they were not. Because as John mentioned, as the supply chain increases, the more and more federal dollars are reaching more and more companies. And I'd say for a lot of government contracting requirements, whether you are a subcontractor, meaning you're performing a part of that government contract, makes a big difference in terms of whether you're a subcontractor performing a part of that contract or whether you are a supplier to that prime contractor. And the easy example I give, right, is if you're making a plane for the government. If you're having somebody build the engine for you, they're a subcontractor. If you're buying light bulbs from somebody to put in your manufacturing facility, they're a supplier. But as John mentioned, all of a sudden we're seeing these threat vectors in different places, and suddenly we have to be concerned not just necessarily with the person who's providing the engine. So for a lot of requirements, we only care about whether you're a subcontractor. A lot of government requirements are only going to flow down to people who are a subcontractor with a capital S. But when you're talking about the protection of data, it's less about whether you qualify as a subcontractor or not, and more about what data do you have access to, even if you consider yourself only a supplier who was very removed from that ultimate end government contract. So I've had to have a lot of conversations, both upstream and downstream, with companies that say, well, I have, all I'm doing is X, and that is so far removed from the performance of this government contract. And that's becoming less of the question. And it's more about what data do you have access to when you're performing X, rather than whether you technically qualify as a subcontractor or not. An example we saw was when the government started, a more tangible example than data security is when the government started a prohibition on the purchase for government agencies of Huawei products, but also products that contained Huawei components or components of certain other Chinese telecommunications products. All of a sudden, it became less important whether you were a direct prime contractor or even a subcontractor. It was somewhere in the line, did a Huawei component get put into the product that you were ultimately delivering to the government. And I think you should think about data security and privacy in the same way. Is the product or service that you're ultimately delivering to the government going to be secure? Was the information secure all along the supply chain, regardless of whether that vendor in the supply chain was a subcontractor with a capital S who needed to have a bunch of FAR flow downs put in their contract?
So
Can I ask
following up on,
Can I ask a quick question on that one, John? Because this is something that I love the example you gave. A lot of light bulbs are now Wi-Fi enabled. What if you buy your supplier and you sell to a government contractor, not even a government contractor, a subcontractor to a government contractor, but they have a secure facility, and and the way you've sourced your light bulbs that are Wi-Fi enabled have Huawei components in them, because a lot of them do. You're now selling Huawei components to a subcontractor that has a secure facility. Does that impact you in terms of your ability to deliver product to your client?
Fortunately, the government did have enough foresight, I think, to put some parameters around what was realistic to ask of contractors. And in the case of the Huawei components, that was a requirement either for prime contractors, a prohibition on prime contractors to use Huawei products in their facilities, and it kind of stopped at the prime contract level, or to deliver a product to the federal government that had Huawei components in it. So fortunately, nobody has to sound the alarms if they had a light bulb as a subcontractor that had a Huawei component in it, at least not yet.
but actually, John, that was a great question, because it actually segues into, I do want to jump ahead just a little bit to, as lawyers, we all know that business to business relationships are governed in the first instance by the contract. The minute the dispute hits your desk, what do? The first thing, let me pull out the contract and read the contract. So when it comes to managing the risks associated with data security and privacy, are there things that our clients need to be aware of when it comes to, their contracts? And maybe, Amy, I'll jump to you first and then following up with John.
Sure. Well, it's important to read them, I will say, first and foremost. And particularly, some people might have the sense of, if you're a government contractor, you have, there's one federal government, there should be one set of cybersecurity regulations. You should see basically the same requirements in every contract. And that is so far from true. The government is very slowly making progress toward kind of a cohesive cyber regime. But right now, it's all over the place. You'll have different requirements for DoD versus civilian contracts. You'll have different requirements for different agencies within DoD. And then sometimes you'll have agencies just completely going rogue and trying to make their contracts, their particular program, extra secure, without actually thinking about the operational realities of that and whether their supply chain can comply. And this is particularly tricky for people lower down in the supply chain who might not even have insight into who the end customer is, which agency end customer is, and therefore have an idea of what clause they really should be expecting to see. But it really is important to understand what the government is asking you to sign up for, and then give some serious consideration to whether you can, in fact, comply with this. And know that it is possible to negotiate with the agency and your customers, your federal customers, when necessary. I've successfully pushed back on an agency that had a suspected breach notification of 24 hours, and that's just very different than what we would expect to see. It's different than what DoD requires in their standard DFARS clause. And we were able to negotiate a different breach notification requirement with the government. I think it helped that all potential offerers had the same issue, but you do have that ability. And also keep in mind that people are getting creative about how to comply with these. I don't mean in the sense of not complying, that type of creativity. I mean in the sense of, I had a client who had a lower tier subcontractor that was just never going to have the systems that were required by a specific DoD clause for cybersecurity purposes. They did everything on paper. There was nothing that touched this lower tier subcontractor's information system because the information system wasn't up to speed. He would prepare his products on paper and deliver them to our client on paper to avoid that. There are plenty of primes who are just giving their subcontractors access to their information systems and just not letting certain sensitive information touch the subcontractor's information system to kind of work around the fact that certain players lower down in the supply chain are just not going to have the sophisticated systems that the government is requiring right now.
And along those lines, John, I'm wondering, cybersecurity, I suspect, is not usually a core component of some of these contracts. I'm wondering if you could just touch briefly on that and also maybe indemnification and insurance and how those factors play into things.
Sure. So kind of to riff off of Amy's comment on read the contract, read the boilerplate. It invariably is going to be a gap, whether you're upstream or downstream, in terms of looking at the cybersecurity components. For example, your standard consequential damages waiver. It's really, really hard to prove direct damages for a security breach when the contract is not for security services. So unless you can figure out some way of making cybersecurity a negotiated component or a material component of the contract, you're going to have problems if you don't carve out cybersecurity from the consequential damages waiver. So look at what your reps and warranties say. Is there a rep and warranty associated with cybersecurity? Is there a rep and warranty associated with compliance with all applicable laws? Because sometimes you might be able to wedge cybersecurity into that because a number of state laws are starting to have affirmative obligations of reasonable security. I don't like that very much, but it is one of those things that's possible to do. The other thing is have an indemnity. Make sure that an indemnity trigger is there in the event that there's a cybersecurity compromise. Also, limitations of liability. You may have a $100,000 or $200,000 contract with the potential for tens of millions of dollars of regulatory penalties in the event that there's a cybersecurity breach. So a lot of the limitation of liability provisions that are normally like 2x or 3x fees paid for the last 12 months won't cover the risk, the actual cost associated with a cybersecurity breach. So, our HVAC vendor at Target, for example, I'm pretty sure that they didn't have, tens of millions of dollars worth of services that they provide to Target every year. So the idea of having the right kind of indemnity, having the caps, limitation of liability, properly carved out for cybersecurity components. And then the last one is insurance, because the risk is so high that you really have a lot of middle market businesses that if they actually got fined to the extent that's possible, they'd be fined out of existence. So make sure as part of the diligence you have with your vendors, they have insurance, and make sure that you have in your contracts, they have insurance specific to cybersecurity.
We only have, we're almost out of time. So I'm going to give each of you like 30 seconds or so and, identify the one or two, probably one of the things that your clients should be doing now to think about addressing data security and privacy. Amy.
If you're in the government supply chain, you should be thinking about the cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC 2.0. It is coming. It is likely going to require NIST 800-171 compliance throughout the supply chain for sensitive data. And the time to think about that is now before the rule comes likely this summer.
John.
Cybersecurity is the same thing as capacity to do business. Contract around it, think about it, do vendor management around it. Do not think of it as a secondary component to your agreements or the vendors you choose.
So great insights. We're out of time. John and Amy, thank you very much for all of your insights. Every time we talk, I learn something. Today's no exception. The CLE code, SS9092, SS9092. Our next TNL webinar will be on February 15th. We're going to be discussing the union organizing landscape in the transportation and logistics industry, and how both union and non-union companies can thoughtfully plan for the future. Please keep an eye out for that invitation. And again, thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon. Take care, everyone.